it is my pleasure to hand back over to Derrik. Again, we've heard from what are we already doing and the great work that's taking place in the context of planning and what happens in the future and the whole theme of uncertainty. What can we do?
Great. Thank you very much, Dave. All right. So now we're really going to get into some more thoughts about where might we go? And a lot of these thoughts we want to present to you. So when you go back to your sub-basin implementation committees and start talking about does your sub-basin look like, I want to give you some ideas that you can start thinking about so you can discuss them. Is this the right thing for your sub-basin? Is it not the right thing for your sub-basin? We're going to just present you a number of options and something that hopefully you'll be able to talk with others about and have an honest conversation about what works for you. What we're talking about here are actions. They are part of your portfolio of how we're managing our basins. You heard about existing actions. Norm and Brenda talked about a lot of great things they're doing right now. That what they have already done is part of the portfolio of how we manage our water. There's some projects, some were discussed today. People asked about on-farm recharge projects. Some people asked about the extraction barrier potential projects. There's other projects that are going on. Those are also part of the portfolio. What we're going to talk about today are the future actions. These aren't actions that are going to solve all our problems by themselves, but they are actions we need to think about as part of the portfolio so we can deal with uncertainty, deal with climate change, deal with things that we don't expect that might come up. Okay, and hopefully these are things you can talk about. These are actions that hopefully help with the uncertainty there. Where they fit in here, we have an existing system. We're not going to, it's a very good system. It takes water from up in the reservoirs, distributes it to the growers, distributes it to the municipalities. All that works fairly well right now. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking today about how we change that system. We're talking about uncertainty, unavoidable challenges, drought, potential growth, change in demand patterns. Our new crops going in, our demand patterns changing over time or in space. What if we have an infrastructure failure? What if there are regulatory changes? Brenda brought this up a little about the conservation as a way of life that's coming down the road here. New regulatory changes. These are all going to be changes, and we have to be able to manage for these. So our question is, what actions can we take as a community to address these? Some of these actions are uncomfortable to talk about. Some people think we shouldn't be talking about them, or could we not talk about them because they're probably something we don't want to implement. I understand that. We've already implemented, as Brenda and Norm pointed out, we've already implemented a number of things that probably you wouldn't have thought we could implement 20 years ago. And we've already seen some great water savings because of those. I think it is our responsibility to talk to you about some other actions we might be taking. At least lay out the options for you. When you get to your sub-basin committees, at that point you can talk about, no, that's an action we don't want to take, or yeah, I think we ought to think about one of those. My point right now is not to judge for you which of these are uncomfortable to talk about or which of these are not popular. It is to lay out the options for you and get you thinking about the options so you can have a good conversation and so you can start planning for the future. So when one of these unavoidable challenges occurs, you'll have a plan in your mind about how you want to address it, and it doesn't hit you at the last minute. That's where we're going right now. So, all management actions are not equal. And I'm going to try as I go through them to point out why they're not equal. And so when you talk about management actions, you'll say, I like it because it has a certain trait. For example, some of them are temporary and some of them are permanent. A some of them you might say, we will do this for the next 3 years, or you'll say, we are going to implement a permanent plan to do this forever. Temporary ones can address things like droughts, things like that. Should we hit a drought? Let's do something. Permanent ones are more long-term actions. You can rely on the benefits from some better than others. Some of them have built-in benefits and you know how much water you're going to save every year. Some of them are going to be, it depends on how people react. We don't know. We expect to see some benefit every year, but maybe not the same benefit every year. So that's a differentiator between them. Some of them are voluntary and some are obligatory. So some of them rely on growers taking a certain action, but we're not telling you have to take an action. We just say this would be something you could do. Some of them are obligatory. They are things saying everybody has to do the same thing there. And they all have a variable cost. Some of them are going to be more expensive. Some of them are going to be less expensive. In general, we hope that the more expensive ones kind of align with the bigger benefit. I can't really say that's true, but that would be what we would hope would happen there. So those are the 4 differentiators I'm going to use right now. There are others we're not going to talk about today, as far as how you might decide what action is a good action. For example, legal implications. I'm not going to talk about the legal implications of any of these. I'm not going to talk about the permitting problems with any of these. There's a lot of other things. If you're a water manager, and when we get to the exercise later in the afternoon, you're all going to be water managers. But there are a lot of things water managers have to deal with. At this point, I just want to sort of give you an overview. So now I'm going to go through, and I'm just going to start going through management actions and the idea is to spark your thoughts and say, that's one that's interesting. That's one that's not so interesting for me. This is not an exhaustive list of management actions. It is some general ideas to get some thoughts going for you. I've ranked them generally from low cost and low benefit to high cost and high benefit there, just so you know how they're coming out right now. They aren't mutually exclusive. You can implement some, you can implement them together, you can implement only one if you want. You will see though that some are closely connected to each other. So it'll be pretty obvious when I get there that, boy, we would, and I'm going to point out explicitly a few places where I'd say you want to implement these 2 together. That's really going to work. So some of them will be individual and some you can work together. Like I say, the idea is to spark your thought process and start saying, yeah, this is the type of management action that's going to work in our subbasin for a certain event, for a drought, for long-term planning, for whatever it is. If we have an infrastructure failure, this is what's going to work for us. Yes, Jerry. That's number 8. That's number 8, Jerry. So with that, I'm going to dive into these. Starting with the lowest cost, and I say low benefit, and this isn't anything about Brenda's great work. In fact, it's low benefit because of Brenda's work. Urban conservation is one that you could implement here. The water savings come from individuals, and you invest in either new practices or new technology. It's a permanent water savings. It's voluntary for individuals, and I say likely obligatory for municipalities. And this gets back to exactly what Brenda was talking about, the conservation as a way of life law that is coming into being out there. The law is written to say municipalities must see some sort of a reduction in use, but it doesn't say individuals have to do anything. It's not on the individual's shoulders, it's on Brenda's shoulders to show the reduction in water use there. So that's where the cost is. So it's relatively low cost. It has a recurring, and I say a low benefit. And the low benefit is there because of what Brenda has already done. It's hard to say that there is enough changes we could make because we've already done a lot of water conservation work in the urban environment. It's hard to say we can make a much bigger impact than what we've already done right now. Not only that, as I pointed out earlier, urban water use is only about 9% of the water use in the valley. So we would be making a small change on a small amount of water use. Low cost, but potentially low benefit on this one. Another one that we think of as a home, sort of as individuals, would be what I've called here decentralized residential water capture. And when I say those words, what you think of is gathering water from your roof and putting it in rain barrels and using rain barrels there. This is the benefit here comes from using stormwater or rainwater instead of groundwater for non-potable uses, for irrigating your yards, for landscape, things like that. It's permanent once you install it. It's voluntary. Nobody's going to force you to put in these rain barrels. It's fairly low cost, and it again is recurring, but it is a low benefit every year. When I say that, it's a low benefit every year on the entire valley. It's a large benefit for the people who do this. It's a large benefit for your individual home. Okay, I have these on my own home. There is a benefit there, but for managing the valley as a whole, it's a fairly small number. Low cost, low benefit. Promoting best agricultural practices, and Norm gave a great discussion on this, and talked quite a bit about what's already been done. And the question is, can we do any more? Actually, I was stunned by Norm's talk about this, how much is being done. The question is, can we do any more? One of the problems, by the way, with these presentations, as I give them in different places, and I've talked to growers throughout the state, the growers who show up at these meetings are the ones who have already done everything. The growers who show up at these meetings are the ones who are interested in water management, so they've already done all these things. So I'm kind of preaching to the wrong group in these meetings. But the question is, are there other people besides who's in this meeting right now who could improve their best management practices there? So as Norm was talking about sort of soil moisture probes, being able to use more of those, that sort of information, it would be, they are generally permanent, because once you start using these best practices, you start getting a permanent benefit. It is voluntary. It's relatively low cost. And again, though, I say recurring but low benefit every year. And the low benefit is for the exact same reason that there's a low benefit on the urban conservation. As Norm pointed out, there's already been a huge conservation effort in agriculture. And, you know, we would be reaching out to the small percentage of growers who haven't already implemented this to say, could you do a little better? So because of that, there's probably not a huge benefit we would see, but it is something to consider. Is it worth trying to get more people to have better agricultural practices? Limit place of use is a very controversial one. And I thought a lot about, should I include it? And I decided to. The example of this that happens in the state are there are certain counties, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, who have passed ordinances saying you cannot pump groundwater and remove it from our county. You cannot take it away. Because what was happening was people were pumping groundwater and moving it to another county, and basically the county where the groundwater came from was losing its water to the benefit of somebody else. And so they said, we don't want this to happen. We are in a single county here, so we're really not going to pass a law saying you can't move it out of the county unless you were thinking of moving it to either Santa Cruz or San Luis Obispo, which I don't think is really anybody's plan. But it is an example of what should we think about. Is there something we should think about limiting place of use where people aren't moving water long distances at the detriment of a certain area, basically. I'm not sure quite how it would work. It has worked in parts of the state. Here we would have to think a little about it. Would it be a big benefit to us? Provide water use data is one of my favorites. I was talking to Perrette yesterday about this, and she made the good point. You can't, it's an old saw that you can't manage what you don't measure. You have to measure things to manage them. And what that leads to is being able to measure data and use it and provide that data is a water management action. Just collecting the data and providing the data appropriately to people is a water management action there. On this one, the idea is, could we provide data, more data to growers so they would make voluntary decisions about how much water they're using and should they improve their water use? The graphic I have to the left is a graphic of an example, what's called a water dashboard. It's being implemented in various places in the San Joaquin Valley. The way these work is an agency, maybe the GSA, maybe Water Resource, somebody, develops this dashboard, and every grower can log into it and see the information for their APNs, for their fields. Nobody else can see the information about your field. You're the only one allowed to see information about your field. And every field, for example, the ones that are highlighted in green over here, as much information as the agency has is provided. How much rainfall you got on that field. Did you import any water? We don't import water in this valley. In places in the San Joaquin Valley, they import water. Were there any river diversions that fed to this field? What was your pumping, say, out of the GIMS database? How much groundwater did you pump and put on this field? How much was the evapotranspiration on this field? How much did your crops use all year long? The idea is to provide the growers as much data as possible so they can go in, start looking at it, and start making individual decisions on should they improve their efficiency. And it's just a information sharing approach that's been out there, and it's being implemented in a few places in San Joaquin Valley. It's up to a medium cost action though, because it's a database that you have to keep providing information on, have to start getting all the ET data on a plot by plot basis, things like that. So there is some cost involved. I'm going to now talk about fallowing. Some people don't like talking about fallowing, and that's understandable. Fallowing is basically saying you are going to make less money this year because you're not going to plant all your crops. But it is a potential way we could save some water, and there are some options in it, and I'm going to present a few options where you might think that is something that maybe in a drought we could implement, or maybe long term. It is an option we need to think about here. As unpopular as it is among some people, I think it is an option that is worth discussing here. If you're not familiar with fallowing, I'm not sure anybody's not familiar with fallowing, the idea is that agricultural land would be idled, and so the groundwater is not pumped to irrigate that land, and so that's where the water savings comes from. I point out the land must still be managed. It's not a free, you aren't using less water for free. You still have to manage your land because you are going to crop it again in the future here. So there is some cost involved with the management of it. So I'm going to talk right now about some various and just a couple options on fallowing of what you might think about when you think about fallowing. And these are the options. Remember I said I'm going to give you some options and they're all kind of related and linked and you might put them all together. That's where we are right now in the conversation. Okay, we're talking about options that you might link together. One of them is just delaying crop replacement. I was speaking to someone here about that just this morning, about delaying crop replacement. So if you have vineyards and you replace the vineyards every so often, one question is, well, could you say wait a year, once you rip your vineyard out, could you wait a year to put the new vineyard back in or so? The water savings come just from you have that 1 year or so where you have effectively fallowed that land. You were going to rip the crop out anyway, and now you're just waiting a little time before you put the new crop in. It's a policy. You could make it a temporary or a permanent policy, but the temporary policy wouldn't be that useful. It'd probably be a permanent policy. It would be voluntary, though. There's nothing saying you have to do this. It would just be an idea. Could you do this to save some water? It's a low cost to the public. It's a medium cost to the grower. All these fallowing ones are a medium cost to the grower because the grower is not making money off his crop that year. So there is a cost to the grower on this. Variable and likely low benefit. It's variable benefit because it depends on when people are replacing their crops. It only occurs when people replace their crops, and the amount of benefit depends on how many acres are being pulled out and replaced every year. So this is kind of a low, I think of this as kind of a low effort fallowing in that you were going to replace your crop anyway. Do you take an extra year with no crop in the ground before you replant it? It only works, of course, for permanent crops, where you're going to pull them out every 20 years or something like that. The kind of similar idea for non-permanent crops, for row crops or greens or something like that, would be rotational fallowing. And in rotational fallowing, what you do is you fallow a plot, or everybody agrees to fallow a plot on a rotating basis, or everybody fallows one of their plots on a rotating basis. There's some way that you say, we're going to move from place to place and fallow a crop there. Like I say, this has to be on annual crops. It can't be on permanent crops. It's a permanent system, because you don't want to say, we're going to start a rotational fallowing system this year, and you three over there are the first to fallow your fields or fallow, a tenth of your fields. And by the way, we're going to end the system next year, so nobody else is hurt. So it is a permanent system, and it is obligatory. Everybody has to buy into it. It has a low cost to the public, a medium cost to the growers, and it does have a recurring benefit every year. This is one now where you're getting to benefits that you can actually pretty much calculate what the benefit's going to be. You know who's going to fallow when, what that's going to mean for your water use. So at this point, you're getting to a point where you've got a pretty good idea of what your benefit's going to be. Both of these fallowing options have a medium cost to the individual growers. One way to address that is with a fallow bank, and this is where we start stitching ideas together. The fallow bank is an idea where all growers, all people in the valley, somehow you get a group, basically you want everybody to buy into this, puts money into this fallow bank every year or so often or so. And it is money. It is a bank. It's money there. And when it is your turn to fallow your land, or if you voluntarily fallow some land, you are allowed to draw some money out of that bank. It's not enough money to probably make up for your loss of crop, but you aren't losing as much money there. Everybody agrees that they will pitch in some money to the bank, and when it's your turn to fallow the land, you're allowed to pull some of that money out and cover some of your costs from fallowing there. So this is the type of thing that you can link in with any of the fallowing projects there. In that way, you see some water savings from the fallowing, and everybody gets to cover part of their costs there. So these are the type of ideas that you want to start linking together and say, is there a system that we could put together that would help us manage, maybe not permanently, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently, but it would help us address the uncertainty of what's coming up. This is also a medium cost action. Now we're getting into the high cost actions. The last few are the high cost, high benefit. First one is retire agricultural land or repurpose agricultural land. Think of this as permanent fallowing. Okay, so there's some agricultural land, it would only rely on willing sellers. This isn't something that we're talking about taking over land. It's if there was a willing seller, we would want to have a bank account where we could buy some agricultural land, retire it, repurpose it for other needs, other uses, other low water uses. It would be permanent. It's voluntary. Like I say, we are only looking for voluntary sellers on that one. It's a high cost. You have to buy the land or somehow compensate the existing landowner, but it is a known recurring benefit every year. That land is no longer irrigating. It's no longer using as much water. We use it for maybe environmental purposes or something, and it becomes a much lower water use parcel. So high cost, high benefit on something like this. Tiered extraction fees. Now we're getting into the really controversial ones. Don't mind going there, but I'm going to go there here. Tiered extraction fees. This idea is that the water savings comes from incentives to use less water. And the idea here is everybody agrees on what I'm going to call an allocation. And when I use the word allocation, what I mean, and I've said this in previous conversations, so this shouldn't be a surprise to some people. When I say allocation, what it is an agreement among everybody of what a fair amount of water to use is. So when I say an allocation, you're thinking you sit down with all your friends and all your neighbors and you say, this is what, did I lose my, okay, all right, I'll speak even louder here. So when I'm talking about an allocation, I'm talking about you sit down with your neighbors and you are saying, this is what a fair amount of water is to use on this crop in this area. And everybody agrees to that. And that's all an allocation is. It's just an agreement on what is fair as far as water and what would be excessive and what would be a small amount of water. Once you've got that allocation set up, one way to talk about it is to say, well, let's have a tiered pricing for using that water. And if you're within your allocation or using less than your allocation, you have a small cost per acre foot. Could be zero, could be a small cost per acre foot. But once you start using more than your allocation, the cost to actually pump that goes up, and it can go up fairly steeply there. And the idea is you're incentivizing people to use a smaller amount of water, because as they use more and more water, they realize the cost of using that water is going to go up steeply, and it might not be worth the benefit there. So this is a high cost, high return action, and it is to have a tiered pricing system, which most, or at least many municipalities already have. It would be a pricing system similar to municipalities, where they usually have a certain cost for your first amount of water you use, and that cost goes up. And you could implement it for agriculture the same way. It is obligatory. Everybody is subject to the same pricing system. There's a high cost for managing the program, but there is a recurring benefit. This is becoming a popular system in parts of the San Joaquin Valley. But remember, the San Joaquin Valley is an extremely overdrafted area. So they are under a lot of pressure to cut back on their pumping.
whether this is the appropriate approach for a place when we're talking about dealing with uncertainty might be a fairly big hammer to do that. But it is an option that's out there. Final one. Hello. Let me see if I can. There we go. Final one is what I call compulsory rationing. And this is the most extreme, at least in my presentation, it's the most extreme management action you would want to take. The example of this that's out there.
Thank you. The example of compulsory rationing that's out there would be something like during droughts when municipalities say you are no longer allowed to irrigate your yards, basically. And they have ordinances that say you cannot do this anymore. So it's not as though compulsory rationing isn't implemented. It is implemented in places. It is generally not implemented in agriculture. It's generally, as far as I know, has mainly been implemented in municipalities. We have to say this would be sort of the ultimate big hammer, though, to say you have a certain amount of water that you should be able to use, and you are not allowed to use anymore there. That would be a very, very big hammer there. But it is kind of the ultimate management action to try and cut things down. So that's kind of the list that I had for you to get you to start thinking about what goes from low cost, low benefit to high cost, high benefit. As you can tell, I really didn't give much thought to whether these will be popular or not. They are just to get you thinking. So when you go to your sub-basin meetings, you can start thinking about where on this scale do you want to be? What do you want to be talking about? What might be an action that, should something unexpected occur, you would, as a sub-basin, you'd be willing to go this direction to address what the unexpected was. As was mentioned, we are going to have an exercise here where you all get to play the part of water manager. We're going to be having some of these actions as options for you. You're going to have to think about which ones you want to implement. We're going to simplify them. So there's only two factors, cost and benefit, of taking out we've taken out the ideas of things like voluntary versus obligatory. We don't want these to be too complicated. So what you'll see is you'll see three groups of actions. One of them is going to be pay a small cost and receive a benefit every year. Remember, some of these I said you will know that you can receive a real benefit every year. Some you're not sure, and some will only receive the benefit when you pay the cost. That's the second one. You can pay a cost and receive a water benefit that year. Think of fallowing there. You pay a cost and you receive the water benefit from fallowing that year, but not in future years. And then the third one is pay a large cost and receive an annual benefit. Think of something like tiered water pricing. There's a large cost there, and you receive a known annual benefit every year. There's going to be more. There's not just going to be three actions. There's going to be more actions, but that's the way we've grouped them in the exercise. And so when you get to the exercise, sort of the ideas that we've gone over now, those are going to be some of the ideas that you're going to see and you're going to struggle with and say, which one of these do we want to try implementing? With that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. All right. Does limit place of use preclude water transfers to subbasins that have deficit extractions?
Let me say it could. One of the things about these actions, I have not seen it yet in any subbasins throughout the state where they have limited place of use subbasin by subbasin. They've limited place of use county by county, because counties have they have some police authority to do this. Let me say that part of deciding what your management actions are, remember you are living with these other people that are in the valley with you here. And so, although I guess in some way it could, that's going to be a legal question that I'm not sure I want to make a statement on right now. Whether you legally could say we are not going to move water out of this subbasin or not. There would be a legal question about that. The other part of that, though, is remember your management actions. The best way to do this is to sort of integrate them with other management actions in the valley so the valley works together. And that's going to be another overlay on the entire problem. I'm sorry that wasn't a very good answer. I think that's more of a legal question than I am willing to answer.
I mean, to your this last point, we expect that as if I may, as Derrik talked about, is at the subbasin scale and these conversations, these planning activities take place. Another variable that those of you that are familiar with Sigma already know is the idea of redirected effects and impacts from one subbasin to another, and that's also, you're required to do that under Sigma. So. Okay, I'm going to read this one. There are a couple of words I don't know if I can read, so whoever, you'll recognize your question and you may need to help me. Huh? Swear words? No, I know what those are. Derrik is a, what? I shouldn't read that. Is the 18400 GSP's water charges framework, in quotations, another name for tiered extraction fees? And these are the words I'm not sure. Compulsory rationing for the water reductions in a State Water Resources Control Board interim plan.
Would you repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, and I think, okay, so, and compulsory rationing for the water reductions in a State Water Resources Control Board interim plan.
Got it. I'll try and answer that. Thank you. So for the first part, the water charges framework was included in the 18400, the original 18400 GSP. It's kind of an expanded version of the tiered water pricing because it did even more than just incentivize reductions in water use. It used the tiered water pricing for all sorts of things, including running the GSA, etc. It was kind of an all-in-one system where there was a financial system that not only incentivized lower water use, but funded projects, funded the GSA, everything like that. It was a grand plan which has fallen badly out of favor and will not probably go forward, but it was kind of an extensive, very large view of what we could do with financing. And that was probably my fault. I reached too far on that and said, here's a great idea we should do, and it's just not going to happen. So the tiered water pricing is kind of a portion of it that still could be implemented, but it is not the whole water charges framework. The question about the compulsory reductions, what is happening here, if the state board takes over a basin or a subbasin because it goes into probation, after a year of being in probation, the state board has the authority to write a new GSP for that subbasin and say, this is the way you're going to manage your water, and this is how you're going to get to sustainability. And the state board has said they don't have many tools in their toolbox. The tool they have is to limit groundwater pumping. So yeah, the compulsory reductions is pretty much the approach the state board would probably take as far as we know, if they take over a basin through probation. That's the only tool in their toolbox, or the only one they're interested in. So that's probably what would happen. Stay tuned for next Tuesday. The state board is going to have their first hearing on their first probationary hearing for the Tulare Lake subbasin. That's happening next Tuesday. We'll see what happens.
Could the fallow bank be funded through Salinas Valley Basin Groundwater Sustainability Agency assessments?
I would say, I suppose that is an approach. I think there is a legal question here, again, on how to fund things, and funding things is not my specialty. So there is a legal question on how you raise money. Is it a regulatory fee? Is it a tax? Things like that. We would have to go through the options and say, what is the purpose of this, and how do we raise funds for it? But I think we would want to look at all the options that the stakeholders are interested in. Again, this is a stakeholder-driven process. So we aren't going to impose a funding system on anybody, but any funding mechanism stakeholders are interested in, I think, would have to go through the process and say, is this a legal process? And if so, how would we do it?
Does tiered extraction fee schedule require a full AMI reporting infrastructure?
Back to AMI. Yeah, everybody's favorite. It requires accurate reporting. As Norm pointed out, the percentage of people reporting is very high in this valley. Probably you're going to hear from Brian Lockwood in a minute. He's one of the only other places in the state that I think has such a good pumping reporting system. Whether it's accurate, again, as Norm pointed out, hard to say. But yeah, there is a need for accurate and timely reporting of pumping. Whether it's an AMI system or some similar system, I'm not sure, but there will be a requirement for timely and accurate reporting. By the way, if the state takes over a basin, they're going that direction also. They're requiring everybody to have meters on their well and report in a timely fashion. So I would say the tiered pumping, yeah, I wouldn't say we need AMI, but we do need accurate reporting on it.
Last question. How can an agency decide about demand management without a cost-benefit analysis for demand management compared to project cost?
I think that is part of the question that the subbasin implementation groups are going to be thinking about. As I mentioned at the beginning, management actions are part of our portfolio. They aren't everything. And that's a great question when you're part of a portfolio. You look at your portfolio and say, where am I getting the biggest bang for my buck? And can I do this in a timely fashion? So there's a lot of questions that all connect. Remember, part of what we're talking about is uncertainty and unexpected events. So maybe the demand management doesn't make sense long term because you think, I'm going to build a big project. But boy, if that infrastructure breaks, or if the regulations change, or if we hit a drought, you don't have time to build those big infrastructure projects. So it is a piece of the puzzle. Cost benefit is part of the decision of where does this fit into the piece of the puzzle, but it's only one question about how these management actions fit into the puzzle.